This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. Our human ambitions have brought our civilization to literally unprecedented heights, but with great damage to the world we live in. Where do we go next? To Mars, argues Silicon Valley billionaire Elon Musk, who's created a remarkably successful space company and an electric car company, and so much more. Joining us is Bloomberg Businessweek reporter Ashlee Vance, who is the author of Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX, and the Quest for a Fantastic Future. But in an approach that's literally more down to earth, one botanist suggests that Native American heritage can guide us to a better coexistence with nature if we understand gratitude and generosity. Wall Kimmerer is a professor at the State University of New York and founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, and the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants, which is now out in paperback. But first, here's my interview with Ashlee Vance about the fantastic future envisioned by Elon Musk. Now, we have something of an obsession with people like this, with extremely rich people, extremely innovative people, and you've got an obsession too. You were working on this book for 18 months before Elon Musk ever said, "I'll say a word to you."
I've tended to report on companies that build things. That's always been my thing. I like going to factories and things like that. I don't know why I'm the only guy in Silicon Valley, I think, that actually likes to do that. And that was sort of how I'd come into it. Was I had done a cover story on Elon for Businessweek, and I'd seen the Tesla factory, and then I saw the SpaceX factory, and it's in Los Angeles, and I just couldn't believe that there was like this rocket factory in the middle of LA, and I thought, okay, I'd like to write more about this. And then when I met Elon, that was the other sort of thing that tipped it over the edge, was just this guy was way more interesting than I guess I thought of him as kind of more one-dimensional and sort of this billionaire technophile, I guess, and then he turned out to be more layered than I thought, and so that kind of pulled me in.
Right, and you talk about how you're interested in reporting on people who make things.
Yeah.
And that really is the differentiating factor for him within perhaps the world today, certainly in Silicon Valley. He's not a guy who, we've seen this quote blown up 1,000 times where some analyst said, well, the greatest minds of our generation are just trying to figure out how to get people to click on more ads.
Yeah.
And he's building stuff.
One thing I try to point out in the book is with the cars and rockets, it's not like the U.S. had given up on these industries. They're obviously big and important, but like the status quo had very much been accepted, especially in aerospace. It was kind of like, this is how we do things, expensive and through the government, and that's just the way it's done. And in the automotive industry, obviously, we had to sort of compete with Japan on quality and catch up there. But as far as like the new technology, sort of, it's like, you can open your trunk with your foot now, and that's kind of the big deal, right? And so I liked that this guy had taken two industries that we had sort of given up on and was like, no, you can still do cool things, and the U.S. can be really competitive just by sort of rethinking this.
And there's a frankly messianic zeal to what he's doing.
Yeah.
This idea of let's build, right now they're building rockets and taking satellites and so forth into space.
Yeah.
And that's a great industry, to be in. You make a ton of money, but fundamentally his plan there is to populate Mars with people so that humanity has a future, right? That's where it started. It started at meetings of what was called the Mars Society.
Right. I sort of tell people this, Elon tells people this, that his life's goal is to put man on Mars, and for some people that makes sense, and some people it just seems totally bonkers, I think. But that is it. That's where it comes from. When he was a little boy, he read all this sci-fi, and I think where other people maybe just kind of thought they were nice stories, it sort of stuck. He saw this as kind of a calling, and then he has this really, the other thing I try to pull out is that he has like a different brand of empathy than I've ever run across in somebody else, which is, I don't really think he has much interpersonal empathy about like, how are your kids, or how's your day going. He could pretty much care less about that, but he has like this empathy for mankind, and obviously we all sort of want the human species to be fruitful, but he's like deeply cares about whether mankind will live and its future, and on a level that the more I reported the book, the more I just was blown away by sort of like how deeply he feels this.
And now, what we can learn by engaging with the world around us and a thousands-year-old tradition from Wall Kimmerer. We know that in the loss of so many Native Americans and so much of Native American culture that broadly in America we've lost something, right? We've lost people, we've lost heritage, we've lost a lot of things. And what you're trying to get at, I think, most here is the idea that we've lost certain wisdom.
Indeed. Not only wisdom, but wisdom which is embedded in an entire millennia-long intellectual tradition of knowing the world and our relationships to it. So what has been lost is knowledge of the land, our relationships to it, in a way that really helps people live honorably on the land.
Right. And you're coming at this from a very fascinating kind of dualistic perspective, where on the one hand, you're a botanist and professor at a university that is thoroughly immersed in kind of Western science methodologies. But then you're trying to wed that with a traditional heritage, and science does not often have much regard for traditional heritage and what it says about what works and what doesn't, and how things go.
Well, it began for me as a young person when I went to the university and found that the values and the thoughts that I had about the natural world were, as you say, dismissed in Western science. Were said, well, that's not science at all. But in fact, it is science. It is what Vine Deloria has called the intellectual twin to science. And so really my whole career has been trying to bring these multiple ways of knowing together. And I think of it as like we have two eyes, right? And our left and right eyes see something different, and it's our brain's job to reconcile those two images. And so traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous people, Western science, are two different lenses.
You wrote about one situation which you were overseeing a graduate student who specifically had a scientific theory based on hearing it from indigenous peoples, and it was rejected out of hand because, again, but what's fascinating is it's rejected out of hand because of received wisdom, right? It wasn't rejected out of hand because of empiricism. So tell that story.
We were working with a beautiful plant for which the book is named, really, sweetgrass, which is a basketry plant. And folks had come to us, native folks who are basket makers had come to us asking for some help because the plant was disappearing. We wanted to know what the effect of harvesting was on that plant. And when my student, Lori Reed, went to her graduate committee, they just dismissed it. And they said, anybody knows that if you harvest a plant, it's going to decline. That isn't science. This is not worthy of a thesis project. But she really persisted. And of course, what the plants showed us is something that Western science would not have guessed at, but is part and parcel of traditional knowledge. That in Western science, they said, well, you know, those plants, if you harvest them, they're going to decline. The plants that are going to do really well are the ones that nobody bothers, because people and nature, they're a bad mix. That's the Western paradigm. But what Lori's wonderful work showed was that, in fact, the grass that was not picked declined. And the grasses that were harvested according to traditional protocol doubled in their vitality. The plants and the people had co-evolved. The people provided a disturbance regime by which that grass could flourish. And that's just outside the Western paradigm, because Western science really thinks about people as having a negative impact on the living world, whereas one of the most important philosophical tenets of indigenous knowledge is that people are active participants in the well-being of the world.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast available on iTunes or your favorite podcast player. The Jewish channel is available on cable: Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, Iowoptum Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.